So, welcome everyone to the Irish American Heritage Museum and our fourth celebration of Halloween, which of course is based on the ancient Celtic pagan festival of Samhain. So this is yet again a hybrid movement. We have a live audience who will be very well behaved and not at all rowdy, and we have yourselves on Facebook. We hope we are gone live on Facebook. I'm just checking. We are. Okay, good. So we have a sort of a mixum gatherum, as we say at home in Ireland. We're going to talk a little bit about traditions and fairly kind of iconic, Irish stories. And then John has some of the more kind of actual stories to tell you. We've done it both ways. Like last year, I did stories by myself, but we talked about the history behind Halloween. And the year before that, and the year before that, a group of us read stories. So these are ones, hopefully we haven't told you all of these ones before. I think we have not, we chose or tried to choose new ones. So let me just grab my notes. So the first one I'm going to talk about, and there's going to be a little bit of sort of history here. This is the Cailleach, or the hag of Beare. Now she's very much associated with Cork and Kerry, but actually there's Cailleach stories told in Scotland and throughout Ireland, certainly parts of Sligo and up the country and stuff. A Cailleach is basically an old woman. This one in Kerry and in Cork was born in Samhain, apparently, which is of course the Irish word for the month of November. So she was born during this ancient festival of Samhain, and she was said to grow younger and more powerful as the year progressed. So she comes into her own like at Bealtaine, but she's responsible for bad weather, for winter, for ushering in the darkness. And so, of course, winter in Ireland, could be hard. There was very poor land in some areas, but of course you would run out of food, during the winter. So there's various different iterations of her, and we're spending time on the Cailleach because later on we're going to talk about witches. But I think this idea of an old woman, particularly a single old woman who possibly has some power or some access to folk knowledge, is very provocative in every culture. So one of the stories told about her is that she was possibly either mother or foster mother to some of the prominent clans, in the Tuatha Dé Danann, like the Corcadina. She is supposed to have had several successive periods of youth, and then her sons would rise up and kind of take over, the Irish lands. She was often veiled. I forgot about my PowerPoint. And so another legend has that she was turned to stone, and that was the picture on the first slide was apparently that tall standing one is either where she was buried or where she's looking out to sea. And so that stone hag is apparently waiting for the return of her husband, the god of the sea. Some people, Lady Gregory wrote about the hag of Beare, so she kind of has come to stand for the women of Ireland at the same time too. And so there is, of course, a far more iconic woman in Irish heritage and in our spooky kind of talks that we're going to be doing tonight. And John is going to talk to you about her now.
Good evening. Depending on who you ask or what you read, the true form of a banshee tends to change. Some will tell you that the banshee is the form of a spirit, while others say that it's a fairy of sorts. There are two things that everyone appears to agree upon. It appears in the form of an old woman. The banshee is one of the most terrifying creatures from Irish folklore. It is believed that the scream of a banshee is an omen of death. It's said that the scream or wail is a warning that death is approaching. Some believe that if you hear the scream of a banshee, creatures from the other world will come and take a member of your family. Keening is a traditional form of expressing grief for those who are dying and those who are dead. The word keen comes from the Gaelic word cuine, which means to cry or weep. Here's where things get a little bit crazy. The practice was carried out by either one or a number of women, and it's believed that they were regularly paid to do so. It's believed that much of the legend of the Banshee stems from this. However, the main difference between the Banshees and keening women is that the Banshees predict death, which is why they spark fear in many. The Banshee sound is one that causes fear in Ireland and is said to be a loud wailing that can be heard from miles around. The Banshee's appearance is something that causes a debate online. Some say she takes on the form of a short old woman with long, dirty hair. Others say that she appears as a tall woman wearing a gray cloak over a bright green dress. One feature of her appearance tends to remain the same in many accounts of what she looks like: her eyes. A Banshee's eyes are said to be roaring red, caused by her constant tears. One terrifying description of her was that she was an old hunched woman that would appear outside your home in the darkest of night. Her face veiled, her hair long, black and billowing in the wind, and her clothing old and tattered. Others say she is a beautiful young woman, combing her hair and weeping piteously. Regardless of whether she's young or old, a fairy or a spirit, or whether she decides to appear to someone night or during the day, her appearance is one that is said to strike fear in all those that lay eyes on her.
So the Banshee is, one of those incredibly popular all across Ireland. And of course, immigrants brought the stories with them to America and to every other country that they were in. As John said, they're sometimes following families. So people say, if you have an O or a Mac in your name, like a McCarthy or an O'Connor, they'll follow you. And the interesting thing about some of these stories that we're going to tell tonight is these would have been told in homes, across the country. And even when I was growing up, my grandmother would tell us about the Banshee. Almost everyone knows someone who has heard it. It's one of those stories, right? So they're really, really ubiquitous across the country. And I think even still, certainly I remember, I think I knew about the Banshee before I saw Darby O'Ginn and the Little People, but that frightened the sugar out of me because I had never seen one before. So that was, it was a very creepy kind of scene. So my next story is about the Overthok. And I'll tell you the story first, and then I'll tell you why it's significant. So many years ago, there lived in the lands east of the Foyle, between Dungiven and Garva, in the Glen of the Eagle, a chieftain, or a petty king, called Overthok. His name implies that he was short in size, or possibly a dwarf. It may be that he had been injured in battle, or through an accident, or possibly because of wizardry, because the people at his time were great warriors, and so they would have liked their rulers to be, very manly and physically strong. But this is conjecture. We just know his name, and all we do know of him was that he was actually a very evil man, feared by the people who lived in his land. His own clan hated him, and certainly the neighboring clans did. So the story goes that after reaching their wits' end, the villagers convinced a rival local chieftain to come in and kill the dwarf. The search to find someone who, would kill him didn't take long. Cahan, or some people call him Cahran, arrived in from a neighboring clan and said that he would deliver them from what they were calling at the time the Nav Marav, or half dead. Cahan agreed to do this, and so he waited, behind a bush one night for the Overthok, slew him, and buried him standing up, as was befitting the fact that he was a great, leader. The villagers were overjoyed. They were in for a shock, however, because the very next day, Overthok rose from the grave and demanded the people in his clan cut their wrists and fill a bowl with their blood. So the fury, terrified the villagers, and they sent word to the rival chieftain to say that they needed him again, that Overthok was not dead. So he killed the dwarf for a second time, buried the dwarf again, and the villagers were relieved. But the very next day, who was walking the earth looking for blood in his bowl? And this time he spread his terror right across Ireland. The chieftain was puzzled, so he decided he would contact a local druid. The druid explained that the chieftain must kill the dwarf and bury him upside down, and that he would need to find a huge stone to lock him in place and keep him in there for good. So for the third time, the chieftain killed the Overthok, but this time he buried him upside down, drove a yew stake through his heart, and covered the grave with this huge stone. Now, interestingly, the stones remain in that little island that I just showed you, in that field, in Derry, which is where, or close to where Bram Stoker's father's family grew up. A manuscript about this legend was published by an anonymous writer, and the writer called the story the Dracula, which is the Irish word for bad blood. And that document was in Trinity College, where Bram Stoker went to school, until about 1868. As a child, also, Bram lived in Clontarf with his parents, and his mother was from Sligo. And he got very, very ill in his childhood, and he was kind of abed for a number of months. And his mother used to tell him stories about where she grew up. So apparently during the famine, of course, people had famine fever, and sometimes people had been evicted, so they were walking the roads. So she had heard a story about a traveler who was carrying an illness and was accosted on the road outside of the town of Sligo and buried, pushed into a grave while still alive. They pushed him in with a long pole so they wouldn't get contaminated. So she had all these horrible memories of the famine and of different, refugee kind of stories. And he grew up across from these attractive looking guys in a church, St. Michan's Church. So there were 400-year-old skeletons exposed in the crypts of the church. And he would go in and play in there. Heads were thrown back, there were mouths open, and he called them the undead, which was, funnily enough, the original title that he gave his story, Dracula. So we have to ask ourselves, was Bram Stoker more inspired by his own Irish childhood or Vlad Tepes in Romania? You can make the decision yourself. So.
That was lovely, Elizabeth. This is the legend of Derg Due, which is another one that you'll hear by certain people in Ireland. The legend of Derg Due begins at a time when arranged marriages were commonplace in Ireland. It was in the corner of Ireland that we now know as Waterford that this tragic tale unfolded. It was in a village in Waterford that a beautiful young woman had fallen in love with a local peasant who worked on a nearby farm. They began courting and talked of marriage and children. Life for the couple appeared to be going according to plan, and the woman's father learned what was going on. He was a wicked man and cared little for his daughter or her love or her wants. The woman's cruel father had decided long ago that he would try and profit from his daughter's beauty. She was the desire of many men, and he knew that he could use this to his advantage. The evil father knew of one man in particular that would appreciate his daughter's beauty and that would be willing to pay generously for her hand in marriage. The man was a local chieftain and was known for his wealth and his family's brutish ways. One night, the father traveled to meet the chieftain unbeknownst to his daughter and made the proposal. The chieftain knew of the woman, and he readily agreed, promising to give the father land and riches in exchange for his daughter's hand. When the woman discovered what her father had promised, she was furious, but her hands were tied. She knew that she could not defy her father. The day of the wedding arrived, and all but two were happy: the newly married bride and the local peasant that was her true love. He decided on that day that he would do whatever it took to get revenge. The woman's husband turned out to be far more violent than his reputation. He used his new bride as a trophy, and he locked her away for days and weeks at a time. Soon her hope evaporated. She stopped eating and drinking, and soon she passed away. Despite her husband's great riches, her burial was a modest affair. To add insult to injury, her husband married soon after. Her father, still on cloud 9 from his new fortune, was too immersed in his own greed to be bothered by his daughter's death. The only person that grieved her passing was her first love. His hunger for revenge intensified every time he visited her grave. Here's where the story takes a turn and moves from tragedy to scary. Here is where the story really begins. So the spirit of the woman was so filled with rage that it forced her out of her grave, lusting for vengeance. Her first stop was to visit her father's home. She arrived in his room while he was asleep and killed him as he lay asleep. And that is the end of that story. There'll be a brief pause while the spirit brings me a page.
What is that on her mouth there? Is that blood dripping down from her mouth?
It looks like a cut. Oh, okay. Okay, so where were we? Oh, yes. Okay, let's go back. So she killed her father. Then she moved quickly to the home of the evil chieftain. When she burst into his room, she found him in a bed with a number of women, void of any sadness or regret. Well, I hope she gets what she's looking for. It's here that the vampire link begins. The woman launched herself at the chieftain and killed him stone dead. Then she proceeded to drink the blood from his body. After drinking the blood of her evil husband, the Derg Due felt invigorated and alive. This feeling gave her hunger for blood that could not be quenched. The Derg Due, red bloodsucker, used her great beauty to lure unsuspecting young men into dark corners. Once there, she sank her teeth deep into their necks and drank greedily. With each new conquest, she got hungrier and hungrier, feasting on the blood of many men under the darkness of night with the promise of love. This is the part of the story that is most frightening. One day, she simply disappeared. What happened to her? Where did she go? The men of Ireland should beware her wrath, as should we all.
Exactly. So did Bram Stoker get his idea about vampires from this story?
Maybe, yeah. He definitely saw that script in Trinity College, and had heard the Sligo story. So it's interesting. He never went to Romania, so perhaps his the Vlad Tepes, the Impaler, all that is historically true, but there was no one ever accused him of drinking blood. He spilled blood. So it's just an interesting little aside. So we're going to talk now about witches. We've talked about the traditional kind of Irish and Celtic, these old ancient stories, sort of inexplicable, forces that roam the land. And in one way, maybe this is actually a scarier, event, because this happens, of course, across Europe, huge witch hunts in Germany and in Scotland, and in America too. We've got the Salem witch trials and in Boston. So this painting is actually from the American witch trials. So I'm going to tell you the story about a witch in 1 second, but I just wanted to go through some of these to show you how kind of widespread, this was. And so the King of England, James of Scotland, wrote a book called The Witch's Hammer, I think. Malleus Maleficorum was, put out there in the 1300s. The Spanish Inquisition, sort of started in heresy, but really it was to do with the witches. And I think the interesting thing about witches is some of it is to do with policing women and their knowledge and their power, as well as their bodies, of course. So all of these, some of these paintings are from little woodcuts earlier on, but some of them go right the way up into the Romantic period. And, witches were seen or usually depicted as ugly old women. If you had any kind of remark, which was that first painting, they're looking for, a mole or what they called the devil's teeth on the woman's body. They were, of course, depicted, here's that hag again. So it's that reference to the Cailleach that we had in Ireland in the, 700s, naked. I should have put a disclaimer up, there's going to be naked bodies in this trigger warning. And, depicted as having a familiar. So that, again, goes back to very ancient Irish, like the puka and these spirits who were shape-shifting spirits. So it's interesting how, cultures across Europe had similar sort of monsters and things to be afraid of. So the women were often depicted, as having these familiars, as you can see in this painting, the trappings of Satan kind of ism and worship. So as religion became more and more into the witchcraft. It's interesting how some of the icons change, you know. And so for sure, you would think, you know, in the early days, like this is a woman teaching a younger woman. Now there's, you know, the skulls are there and the familiars are there. So it's kind of a dangerous thing that an older woman is passing on her wisdom. And, you know, the interesting thing I think about this is this sort of coincides with the professionalism of medicine, where men are trained, you know, to become doctors, and they take over the midwiving duties, and the chainsaw was invented, for instance, to cut your pelvis, you know, like it wasn't invented for trees. And so it's interesting that women's supposedly secret knowledge, which of course was not knowledge, it was often born of experience, it was kind of grounded in nature, but that becomes something very scary, you know, and then something that's demonized. So all of these are just different depictions of women across Europe. And, you know, the kind of the fear of these women and their power. So here's a woman being arrested, you know, again, like an old woman. And that was the thing, you know, sometimes they're not necessarily older women, but certainly the Salem witch trials and people like Goody Glover in Boston, you know, it was easy to target some of these women if they were older, if they were maybe, you know, widows or spinsters that had no one to kind of fight for them. But it's interesting with the Salem people, a lot of those people had lots of land, they had access to, you know, wood and stuff. And so it was neighbor against neighbor. And you kind of think maybe there was less supernatural and more greed, you know, going on. So the story that I want to tell you about is one of Ireland's most famous witches and one of the earliest witches we have in Ireland. There's a famous Jonathan Swift quote about how the law impacts the rich and poor in unequal measure. He said, "Laws are like cobwebs, which may catch small flies, but they let wasps and hornets break through." Interesting for today as well, right? And this interpretation was certainly the case 3 centuries ago, when Irish law declared that Petronella de Meath was to become the first woman burnt to death following accusations of witchcraft on November 3rd in 1324. This is the papal bull that kind of started the heresy claims against women. So Petronella, witchcraft was not yet listed in the statute books in Ireland as a crime. So the term used to convict her was heresy. Petronella was a maidservant. She was about 24 years of age when she was accused and convicted. But she was just an accomplice to her employer, who was Dame Alice Kettler. And she was the intended target of these accusations. But Alice was a very powerful noblewoman who had miraculously outlived 3 husbands. Perhaps there was some suspicion, you know, cast on her there. She was on her 4th marriage, and her various stepchildren came together to bring accusations of sorcery, murder, and witchcraft, because she had manipulated all of her previous husbands, had left all of the money to her. The probable reason, for this was because she had become powerful and rich at her stepchildren's expense, and they felt that she had cheated them out of their rightful, you know, inheritance. But because she was so powerful and connected in her own right, she was able to flee Ireland, and she escaped the charges. But this left her servants very vulnerable. So Petronella faced the wrath and fury of the accusers, among whom the Bishop of Ossory. So she was tortured and flogged, Petronella was, and brought through 6 different parishes to be humiliated and persecuted before she eventually confessed to the crimes against her. Now, you know, after weeks of torture, I think I'd agree to anything as well. So many of the charges were naturally typical of the time and were concocted based upon church superstition and a willful attempt to suppress and distort the ancient folkloric practices and cures. So the accusations, you know, said that she was sacrificing animals and burying their remains at crossroads to conjure demons. She was charged with making potions from the body parts of children and participating naturally in lustful associations with an entity who appeared as either a dark-skinned man or he could transform into a cat. So this, you know, is not Petronella, but this was how they did burn women at the stake. This is actually from, I think, a Holland woodcut of religious martyrs. So Alice escapes, and we know that the witch hunt starts, you know, very much accelerated, but not so much in Ireland anymore, which is interesting. I don't know if they, you know, weren't interested kind of in Irish witches. There was probably other things going on, but we don't have a witch hunt the way, you know, certainly England and parts of Scotland and definitely, you know, Germany does. So although the last woman burnt in Ireland was in the very late 19th century. Her husband and father burnt a woman in kind of the Tipperary Cork border, accused her of being a fairy, Bridget Cleary. So, you know, some of the beliefs persist, but the system did not go after women as much as they did in Europe. So now we'll go back to a more traditional ghost story from John.
This is the story of the Shattered Mirror. In 1685, Lady Margaret Hodnett resided at Belvelly Castle. The Hodnett fortunes were at their peak. The beauty of Lady Margaret was a legend, even as far away as Holland, from whence came many of her suitors, one of whom was no less a person than a stripling of the House of Orange. She played fast and loose with a lot of them. For as fabulous as her beauty was of face and figure, her beauty was a flutterbox, to use an old Irish term. Shallow, capricious, wantonly unrestrained, she was as wild as a hawk, causing trouble wherever she approached. When she was rounding around 25, she caught the erstwhile eye of one Clone Rockenby of Castle Harrow, which stood high above the Bay of Kinsale. Rockenby was of a cadet branch of the rich and powerful Desmonds. Lady Margaret not only caught this stalwart's eye, she held it for years, to her final undoing. For while she kept Rockenby dangling, imperious to the hilt, she would send him packing every few months in a fit of pique, only to recall him to post haste when she was bored. He always came running. The final slamming of doors had taken place in the late summer. Realizing that further entry was futile, Rockenby resolved on a plan very much in keeping with that era. Clone Rockenby rode back to Castle Harrow. Here he called his captains of men to arms together. In a few days, Clone, with his 2,000 men, set out for Castle Desmond, near Baltara. He knew that his uncle, head of the fighting Desmonds, would help him. He gave Clone a further 1,000 men. It was not to be open warfare, just a siege to starve his upstart Hodnett woman into submission. It irked Clone to think that, treacherous and foolish as he knew Margaret Hodnett to be, he loved her extravagantly. There it was. Winter came down the valley of Lee with harsh, wet winds. Cold gusts of sleet blew in from the sea. Even in County Cork, where winters are usually mild, cold from 2 quarters bode a bad winter. The standing of the siege took all of Belvelly Castle by surprise. They had not even thought to lay in provisions for the winter. Hodnett still trusted to baggage trains coming in weekly from Cork. Clone deployed his men to harass these provisions routes. He aimed to get just enough food filtered through to keep alive the family and garrison of a few hundred men at Belvelly, hoping that this method would reduce the strength of their arms to a negligible point and break the will of Lady Margaret. 1 year passed. The second winter set in as soft as summer. Clone allowed no harvest to reap by the Belvelly farmers, lest they tried to smuggle in grain to their overlord at the castle. The plight within the walls of Belvelly was rapidly becoming desperate. Why Margaret's father allowed this state of affairs to drag on, no one knows. He did not force her to accept Clone Rockenby and lift his shameful siege as a mystery. Every once in a while, a small group of men from the castle garrison would wheel out on half-starved horses and make a terrible battle. Presently, after a few men were killed on both sides, they would gallop back under the portcullis. A few times, Clone saw a wan, hungry-looking Lady Margaret walking on the battlements. She made no sign that she ever saw him. The third winter of the siege was set in wild, bitter cold. By this time, Rockenby himself was mortally tired of this stagnant state of affairs. He called his captains and made them completely cut all supply lines. Within a fortnight, a white flag waved fitfully from a spear point at the grill. Clone called his 2 captains. They approached the silent tower. A dreadful sight met their eyes. Bodies of men starved to skeletons lay in distorted heaps. The stench of unburied dead made them retch. Entering stealthily under the arched gateway, Claude found himself in the inner court. He came face to face with Lady Margaret. Her reddened eyes looked out at him with great desolation. She was so weak from hunger she could scarcely stand. She leaned on the arm of an old serving woman and wept miserably. Lady Margaret stood with her back to the mirror, looking Claude full face. Pointing to her face, she said, "Look, look what you have done." Then she turned slowly, slowly, until reflected in the depths of the Venetian mirror at the foot of the stairs was a pitiful, shivering woman. The mirror, which for years had given back from its shadows the face of a beautiful Lady Margaret. As Claude watched, his voice perished in his throat. He could not speak to her. Great tears slid down his face and he swayed in weakness. Claude could stand this no longer. He grasped his sword by the end, and with a heavy hilt, he destroyed in one stroke the glass and its ghastly reflection. Lady Margaret gave a piercing shriek. Flinging up her arms, she clutched the frame of the shattered mirror. It slipped from her grasp, and she sank to the floor in a dead faint. Turning swiftly, Claude made for his camp across the river, where he gave orders to lift the siege that night and send food to starving inmates of the tower. On the battlements crouched a young brother of Lady Margaret. He had watched the scene in front of the mirror. After seeing his sister carried to an upper room and tended, he had rushed to the battlements along the shoulder. Carefully, he fitted a bronze-tipped arrow to the thong of his bow. Oiled deer hides thong had strength and power. The bow took aim, the arrow released from the bow, released to its mark like a death laden. The dagger tip embedded in the cheek of Claude Rockenby just as he was crossing the bridge. By the time his men reached Claude's side, he knew that he was dying. The men lifted him in their arms and bore him to a tent. "Lift the siege fed, gave them food," Claude said. Then his head lolled, but suddenly he stiffened and murmured, "Margaret, I curse you. May you search for mirrors all your life and never find." Lying back in the arms of one of his captains, Claude Rockenby died on the frozen ground in front of Belvelly Castle. It is said that Lady Margaret Hodnott only partially regained her beauty. After she recovered from the terrible effects of the long siege, her inordinate love of mirrors suffered an eclipse. At first, she would not have mirrors anywhere around, probably remembering too well the frightful reflection of her face given back by the mirror the day it was shattered by Claude Rockenby. Later, she had small mirrors and took them out. This was after her mind began to go. When her father died, Lady Margaret inherited Belvelly Castle. Suitors again began to claim her. One learned she took lovers, but none of prominence or of lasting interest. She never married. When her mind began to wander, it was in unaccountable ways. At first, such a tempting dam up to the River Lee, which is a public waterway. She flew into a rage when threatened with imprisonment and shut herself up, becoming a recluse. Soon, her madness increased. She would wander through the rooms of Belvelly, rubbing spots on the wall. Leaning close, she would peer into these spots and preen herself as if in front of a mirror. She died in a barred room in the castle. The house passed to a distant kinsman. Later, after 1830, it was abandoned as a living quarters, even to the tenant farmers who reclaimed it in a few years. Those who have seen the ghost of Lady Margaret Hodnott disagree about her face. Some say a thick white cloth or veil obscures it completely. Others say she has no face, only a sphere of pale luminous mist which floats above her shoulders, where the face should be. All, however, say she walks around the castle rooms, rubbing the stones with her forearms, then bending forward as if gazing into a mirror. Some of the large stones in the walls of the rooms of Belvelly Castle are rubbed much smoother than others. They gleam almost as if glazed with a burnished enamel. If one stoops a bit, the reflection of one's face appears, blurred slightly, as if reflected in water.
Vanity is another sin. It's looking like the Irish don't have much luck with love, I have to say, you know, particularly the poor women. So this next story that I'm going to tell you is a kind of a traditional Irish one as well. And my grandmother definitely said she saw this in County Limerick in the late 1920s, early 30s. But, you know, maybe you need to take that with a grain of salt. So the story of the death coach is from Irish folklore. And, you know, one man's particularly frightening experience of seeing the coach de Beare, or the death coach. All over Ireland, not only do people listen for the sounds of the wailing Banshee that we'd heard about, but they also look out for this death coach. It is said that if death is coming to someone that you know, or possibly yourself, the death coach will be sent and it cannot return without bringing somebody with it. So one fine summer afternoon, Michael Noonan was walking into the town of Ballyduff to collect a pair of shoes that he had left with his cobbler. His way took him on the little path alongside the river past what is now a derelict mill. To Michael's surprise, he could hear as clear as a bell the sounds of huntsmen and hounds at full cry, even though he knew that this couldn't be true because the Due Hallow hounds, which were formed in 1745, were in a totally different area normally. Fear took the place of Michael's surprise when he heard the unmistakable clack, 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 clack of the mill's mechanism working as if but it had been deserted years previously. He ran as though the hounds were chasing him all the way into Ballyduff. Upon reaching the cobblers, a breathless but relieved Michael met his old friend and neighbour, Darby Haynes. Darby was a carrier by trade. Waiting for his nephew to get to town, he asked Michael to take his horse and cart home. Michael was only too happy to assist because he certainly didn't fancy the walk past the mill, especially as it was now getting dark. The dark, as it turned out, was to be the least of Michael's worries that night. The moon rose full and bright like tonight, clearly lighting the road. Michael knew the horse had had a hard day's work, so he drove home slowly. Settling comfortably back in his seat, Michael lazily watched the reflection of the moon in the river, letting the old horse lead the way. Suddenly, he sat up bolt right as the reflection of the moon disappeared. It was a cloudless sky, so where had the cloud come from? What Michael saw next turned his blood to ice, because looking around, he saw a large black coach draw silently alongside him. The coachman and 6 horses were all draped in black. That was not terrifying enough, however. They were all headless. The coach quickly came abreast and passed the frightened Michael. The coachman laid his whip soundlessly across the back of the horses, and he disappeared as quickly as he had come into view. Michael Noonan, trembling now, somehow made it home, settled the horse in the field, and got sleeplessly through the night. So he escaped the death coach, but who did it collect that night from town, I wonder? So that's a still from Darby O'Gill, because not only does Darby have the Banshee, but it also has the death coach. And some people tell the story, I think we told it last year, about the headless horseman, the Dú Hallow, which is also kind of connected to this story. So you can see that some of them survive, you know, from earlier iterations into kind of Victorian era stories. But you're up.
Okay. So, tales of meetings with the devil are very common in Ireland, maybe because they have a lot of crossroads there, and the devil seems to like appearing to people at these turns in the road. The ghost of Castleton House is just one of the many ghost stories of such encounters. Many a tale was told by old men sitting around a turf fire, sipping a lot of Irish whiskey, of hoof pints appearing in the snow atop roofs, or of a strange man offering to make a traveler rich beyond his wildest dreams, the cost the traveler's soul. This particular story doesn't take place in a crossroad, but in a stately home in Selbridge, County Kildare in the 18th century. In Selbridge, there stands a beautiful stately house which was built by William Conine, who was the Speaker of the Irish Parliament in 1722. Connolly also built the infamous Hellfire Club, which was cursed from the beginning. After the death of Connolly in 1729, his widow, Catherine, continued to live there, hosting extravagant parties, becoming famous for her hospitality. After her death in 1752, the house passed to her nephew, William James Connolly of Ballyshannon. He was married to Lady Anne Wentworth, daughter of the Earl of Stafford. It was to her that the gentleman in question first appeared. One day she happened to see a strange, tall man standing in the upper gallery. He proceeded to walk down a non-existent staircase, taking tiny steps as though the staircase steps were very small. He paused by a large window and started to laugh, a high, mocking, cruel, arrogant laugh that sent chills down Lady Anne's spine. She looked down upon the stricken lady as though he was the rightful owner of the house, and she a lowly servant. 10 years passed with no more appearances. Connolly expanded on the original house and built a staircase exactly where his wife had previously seen the man. More than 20 years passed, and the house was now owned by William and Anne's son, Thomas Connolly, and his wife, Lady Louisa, who was the great-granddaughter of King Charles II. One day, Thomas and Lady Louisa went walking in the beautifully landscaped grounds of their stunning home. Thomas was recalling the tale of the strange man to his wife. A few days later, on a wild November day, Thomas went out riding with the Kildare hounds. Many of the hunters turned for home as the elements were against them, not unusual for the weather for that time of November in Ireland, and the fox was proving to be very wily and elusive. Only a handful of riders, including Thomas, decided to brave the storm and carry on. Turning in his saddle, Thomas noticed a newcomer to the group. Sitting atop a fine black stallion, which looked so fresh as it just left the stables, was a tall fellow dressed in gray with great high boots. Thomas called out to the man, "Good day to you, sir. A poor day for sport." But the man did not answer, just merely grinned at Thomas, showing a slightly discolored teeth before turning his horse and proceeding to ride up the slope of the hill. At that exact moment, the hounds started to bay and howl as though they had closed on the fox. Thomas galloped up the hill, following the sound of the baying hounds. When he reached the top of the hill, he reined the horse in, astonished as the hounds were nowhere to be seen. Instead, to his surprise, his eyes fell upon a shocking sight. The stranger had dismounted his horse and was standing with the bloody corpse of the fox proudly above his head. The stranger smirked at Thomas as he lowered the fox, and in one bite, he bit the tail straight off the poor fox. Dropping the carcass, he offered the brush to the now totally disgusted Thomas. The young squire, feeling sick, turned to leave, refusing the terrible gift. The man stopped him in his tracks when he spoke. "Connolly, if you will not take the brush, will you offer me a cup of something hot in your great house?" Thomas and Lady Louisa, like his great Aunt Catherine, were famous for their warm hospitality, and although the stranger with his leering smile turned Thomas' blood to ice, he felt he could not refuse the man. Reluctantly answering the man, Thomas said, "There is hot rum punch at my house for all that wants it." Entering Castleton House at Connolly's side, the stranger paused as he looked around the great entrance hall. Spying the staircase, sweeping down the gallery, the stranger emitted a low, hissing laugh, much to Thomas' disgust. The stranger, following the other huntsmen, took a soft seat by the welcoming fire. When a servant approached the man to help him remove his soiled boots, the stranger waved him away, snarling, "Leave me be. I am sleepy and do not wish to be disturbed." The man quickly settled down for a comfortable nap. Curious, Tom approached the man for a better look at him. Astonished now, Thomas took a step back when he saw how hairy the man was. Hair covered the back of his hands and seemed to carry on up his sleeve. Tufts of coarse hair sprung from his ears. Warily, Thomas called for two servants to remove one of the boots of the now soundly sleeping stranger. Carefully sliding the boot off the man, the servants cautiously revealed a thin, hairy leg, terminating in a great black, hairy hoof. The company all leapt from the fireside, terrified by what they saw. Thomas quickly sent a servant to bring the parish priest. When the priest arrived, the stranger awoke. Seeing that his boot had been removed, the stranger leapt with a snarl and stood by the mantelpiece, despite the heat from the roaring fire. The stranger let loose a high, chilling laugh, exactly like Lady Anne had heard all those years before, freezing the blood of all who heard it. The priest, petrified, tried to mumble out an incantation, much to the amusement of the demonic eloper. In desperation, the priest threw his missile at the figure. He missed his target and hit the mirror above the fireplace, shattering it into a million pieces. The threat of being hit by the holy book was enough for the strange man, who leapt into the air and vanished. The only sign that he had ever been there was the dirty, greasy boot and the huge crack in the stone fireplace. The ghost of Castleton House has never been seen since. Ghosts in Ireland, like ghosts all around the world, can attach themselves to families, or in particular, family members. The Derringolly farmhouse ghosts seem to do just that. The haunting of a family, in particular their daughter, takes place in Derringolly farmhouse, just located outside the county. The events took place in the late 19th century. Farmhouses around the 19th century in Ireland typically consisted of a living room, which would have been used also as a kitchen, and two rooms off to the side, which had been bedrooms divided out among the family. Of course, there would have been no such thing as electricity. If you were lucky, oil lamps would have been the order of the day. All cooking and heat would have come from a large open fire, burning mainly wood and turf. This farmhouse consisted of the farmer, who was widowed, his son, and his 4 daughters. The eldest of these children was Maggie, who was around 20 when the haunting started, and they seemed to center on her. The first sign that anything was amiss was when a loud rapping and scratching sounds could be heard throughout the night. Then objects started to move about. Items could be found outside the farmhouse, especially after a night of continuous banging and rapping noises. Lamps and candles proved impossible to keep in the cottage and were always found outside in the morning. The father, a Methodist, was told to leave a Bible open, its pages weighted down by stones, in the room where Maggie and her sisters occupied. There was to be no avail, as the stones were removed, and indeed the pages of the Bible were ripped out. Sir William Barrett, a famous Paris psychologist, visited along with Mr. Thomas Plunkett from Emerson. In his report, quoted in part by Peter Underwood in the Irish Gazette, states, as the children, except the boy and Maggie, returned in bed, Maggie lay fully clothed on top of the bed so that her arms and legs could be seen at all times. The rest of us settled around that kitchen fire when a faint rapping sound could be heard, louder, apparently coming from the walls, the ceilings, and other parts of the hidden bedroom to which the door had been left open. On entering the room with a lamp, the noises stopped, but commenced again once the lamp had been placed on the windowsill. I kept the boy and his father by my side and asked Mr. Plunkett to look around outside. I eventually was able to approach the bed, where I saw the younger children asleep and Maggie lying motionless, whereas the noises were still as loud as ever. Under close inspection, there was no explanation for the noises or items moving. Suddenly, a pebble landed on the bed beside Maggie with no matter of Barrett visited the farmhouse on the next 3 nights with other members of his congregation. The events were the same as the noises repeated. Additional experiments were carried out by Barrett and others prompted by the farmer. Barrett asked questions and the answers being given by a number of raps. Each time, the correct number of raps was given. Finally, one of Barrett's companions, Reverend Maxwell Close, read some passages from the Bible. At first, there was a tremendous din. Then it gradually got fainter and the noises disappeared by the time he got to the Lord's Prayer. After that, the Derg haunting came to a stop.
Oh, convenient. So we were going to kind of come back to those themes in John's 2 stories there. One, and I think these are both very important for, Irish and Anglo-Irish history as it was unfolding, of course, in the country. So the theme of hospitality is very important, that either you must be hospitable, but you could be taken advantage of, or sometimes you're punished if you're not hospitable. And of course, this other, idea that even Protestants in the country were being targeted. And so the Castletown story is almost identical to a story that's told about a big house in Waterford. I think I told it last year, Loftus Hall, which is officially still Ireland's most haunted house. It's actually for sale at the moment if anybody wants to buy it. And but my great grandmother was from Waterford. It's actually in Wexford. It's on kind of the border, but she had heard stories, about this house which are absolutely horrific. And the interesting thing too is the interplay of religion. So sometimes a Catholic priest is invited into a Protestant home to do an exorcism, or in the case that John just read, sometimes even the prayers like of a Methodist, are enough. You don't need the Latin rites of exorcism. So this is more of a traditional Celtic one, we're going back to something sort of supernatural. And so, of course, I mentioned earlier on the puka, which is kind of a shapeshifter. But of course, the other thing we have in Ireland too are these fairy forts, as we call them, areas of land that are marked by either a different color grass or a circle of trees. And certainly until, when I was a child growing up, you were warned, not to enter a fairy fort, or if you went in, not to touch anything, not to pick a flower, not to desecrate it in any way. So this is kind of one of those traditions. It's called the Haunted Woods, or the Beast of Toomgraney Woods. And so this is a story that takes place in a wood just outside the town of Toomgraney in County Clare, and it's a Halloween story because apparently this beast only appears during Halloween. The tale of terror could be seen as a person witnessing a battle between good and evil, or a simple warning to Irish travellers to be aware of where they choose to wander. Around Halloween, the residents of Toomgraney avoid a certain wooden hollow, and with good reason. A young man, either forgetting the stories or being skeptical, decided, as it was a beautiful autumn day, to go for a walk in these very woods. As he wandered in among the trees, a strange sensation came over him, a mixed feeling of fear, followed by immense sadness. He decided, as he was carrying a stout stick, that he would forge on ahead. Unable, however, to rid himself of this feeling, he almost turned back when he noticed that the trees seemed to get thicker and he could not find the path home. His imagination now started to run wild with images of pagan times and cruel blood sacrifices and rituals. Stopping still, he felt the omnipotent silence surrounding him. Gone was the beautiful autumn day. Not a ray of sunshine could penetrate through the suffering trees, nor could he hear birds singing to one another. Suddenly, movement in the bushes caught his eye, and he saw a huge black dog that he thought must be a stray wandering far from home, until it turned to face him. The dog, staring at him, had huge glowing red eyes and disappeared into the bushes. Turning around, the man's heart nearly took flight when a large Irish hare jumped in front of him, an expression of malevolence equal to the dog glaring out of its evil red eyes. It too bounded off into the dense dark foliage. Fear now coursed through his veins as a cat leapt into view, its coat like freshly spun straw, its back arched, fangs bared, and it hissed as its red eyes, brimmed with malice, stared straight at the man before it also silently retreated into the shadows. Terrified beyond reason, the man would have fled back the way he came, but the ground seemed to spin and rise, so he ran blindly forward through these ever-enclosing trees. Stopping abruptly, he realized he was in a clearing, and with the coming dusk, it appeared darker than the forest had been, and through the murkiness, he could see two figures. One was a black ram with evil red eyes and enormous razor-sharp horns, the other an ordinary deer. They appeared to be caught in a struggle, a battle for life and death. Wounded and battle-weary, the poor deer fell to its knees, looking to the man with a cry for help in its tear-stained eyes. The man suddenly felt courage replace the fear in his heart. So screaming and brandishing his stick, he rushed the ram in an attempt to beat it away. But his blows met with nothing but air, as the ram seemed to be made of mist. And when in turn the rain buffeted the man, he fell to the ground, winded and in pain, and he momentarily blacked out. Coming to, the man found the scene deserted and the trees not so dense. He felt as though he maybe had imagined the whole event, but as he got to his feet, he realized that the pain he had endured in his struggle with the ram was real enough. Wearily making his way home, he retold the story that night as though it was a dream, until his old uncle confirmed that others had stumbled into the beasts of Toomgraney forests, and it was definitely a place to avoid at Halloween. You're up.
So this is the story of the Conine ghost. The story goes that a widow called Mrs. Murphy, her son and 5 daughters all lived together in a house near Conine in the early part of the 20th century. The family became plagued by a poltergeist shortly after Mrs. Murphy's husband died in a freak accident. Paranormal events started to occur in the house. It began with the occasional knocking on the front door, and when any member of the family would go to answer the door, there would be nobody there. The noises then became more frequent, with knocking on all the doors and windows. Above the house was a room that was used for storage for hay. The room was the only accessible by a stone staircase adjoined to the farmhouse, and in the room heavy footsteps were often heard, yet every time someone went to investigate, there was nobody in the room. The family decided to get friends and neighbors to come to the house and listen to these strange noises for themselves. Mrs. Murphy, her children, and some friends would sit in the kitchen listening to the banging on the windows and the doors and the footsteps coming from upstairs. Unfortunately, things took a turn for the worst when more intense paranormal activities started to happen. Mrs. Murphy would watch, lift off the table and fly across the room, smashing against the walls. The family would also watch in the bedroom as a bed would lift several inches above the ground by itself and fall back down again. Things got so bad that Mrs. Murphy turned to the church for help. Father Coyle visited the house and watched for himself as mysterious shapes appeared and disappeared on the walls as he stood inside the house. He also watched pots and pans that would suddenly fly across the room on their own. Another witness to the events was Chair Healy, who could simply not believe what he was seeing. Father Coyle was given permission for 2 exorcisms to be performed in the house. It is said that during the exorcisms, bed sheets would fly off the beds, cups and plates would fly around the room, and deafening groans could be heard coming from upstairs. Both exorcisms were among the very few exorcisms to be ever carried out in Ireland. Unfortunately, they did not work, and the Murphy family continued to live in the house with the poltergeist. The Murphys were understandably terrified that they had hoped the exorcisms might work. However, the poltergeist activity in the house seemed to be getting worse. It is also said that friends and neighbors started to blame the Murphys for practicing witchcraft, thereby bringing on the entity themselves. There were claims that Mrs. Murphy's son found a book in a forest near Conine called The Legions of Doom, and was supposed to give instructions on how to practice satanic rites, how to conjure demons, etc. The son started to develop an unhealthy interest in the spirit world and was supposed to have tried to raise a demon spirit in the house. It was this story, among others, that became the last straw for the Murphys, and they decided to leave their home and set sail for America in 1913. But that's not the end of the story. Much to the horror of the Murphys, it seemed that the poltergeist had followed them on the boat to America. It is well documented that passengers on the ship complained about rappings and bangings that were coming from the Murphys' cabin. The noises became so bad that the captain went personally to Mrs. Murphy to tell her to stop making so much noise in her cabin. It started that the captain could not believe that there was a poltergeist on the ship, but did, however, threaten the Murphys that he would put them off the ship if the noise continued. It is known that the poltergeist activity did follow them to their new home in America, but over time, the manifestations and rappings subsided and eventually stopped completely, allowing the family to get on with their lives as best they could. One of the girls of the family was so traumatized by these events that she is said to have spent the rest of her life in a mental institution in America. As for the Conine house, it is claimed that a ghostly presence still remains there to this very day. It moved back, I guess.
So yeah, so that's the house today, and apparently it is still, that's it,
Oh,
and
lovely.
it's apparently still empty. So this story and the two that I'm going to read now raise an interesting point about immigration and, you know, bad luck following you, but also maybe it's a commentary on trying to assimilate, you know, or try to integrate into a new home, or, you know, how does homesickness kind of manifest itself. So we'll tell you first the story, the tragic tale of Helena Blunden. And actually I found there's footage of her singing, which we might be able to play later on. So Helena Blunden was 16 when she began working in the spinning room of a linen mill in the Old Market area of Belfast. The eldest daughter of a Tyrone woman and a Kilkenny man, Helena had been born in Ireland but was brought up in England. In 1911, the Blundens returned to Ireland and settled in Belfast. They returned to Ireland, of course, at a time when the Parliament in Westminster was looking like it would placate one group of Irish politicians only to provoke the wrath of another. So we know in 1912, you know, the government, the Home Rule Bill is passed, but there's going to be some provision made for Ulster. With the reform of the House of Lords in 1911, the Lords' power of veto over Home Rule was limited now to a 2-year delay. So the passage of the Home Rule Bill through Westminster was assured, which would grant Ireland a domestic parliament and allow a degree of political independence from England. An ardent home ruler, Helena's father would have preferred to settle in Dublin, but Helena's uncles on her mother's side had already arranged jobs for all of the Blunden family in Belfast. So they moved into a small terraced house in Raphael Street, which was only a few hundred yards from the linen mill. Helena was a diligent and popular worker in the mill, a loud, cheerful young woman. Her head was full of the romanticism of Yeats' poetry, the wit of Shaw's plays, and the raucous songs of the London music halls. Her granduncle had been a wandering Irish dancing master in Kilkenny, and she had inherited his talent for dance, but she was more interested in singing than dancing. As a child, she had sung in a school choir in England, and since returning to Ireland, she danced and sang at Feshinas in Dublin. Her father encouraged her aspirations on the stage, although her mother frowned at the notion. Helena had grown up among the immigrant Irish in London and had invented a peculiar English accent, which impressed her fellow workers. Her aspirations and songs, her accent, and her memories of London guaranteed her a captivated audience, and she enjoyed the attention. The work in the spinning mill was arduous and repetitive. On warm days in summer, when the heat reached boiling point, children and women at work often fainted. The atmosphere was always damp with stale air, condensation settling on the walls and floors of the mill. Margaret Maxwell was a tough woman who in her youth had brawled with men and women in the street. But no longer fit to fight or to work in the flax room, Margaret was now employed in the afternoons to mop and clean the condensation from the stairs in this factory. Pride made her resent the work, but necessity made her stay. She was content to complain fiercely and scold anyone who dared walk on the stairs while she mopped. She frightened the young children, but the adults only ignored her threats. She often clashed with Helena, deriding the young woman's songs and hope. Like many factory workers, Helena worked 60 hours a week. On Saturday, the working day was supposed to finish at 12, at noon, but the workers always stayed late if an important order needed to be prepared. The linen company's first order had been to produce double damask linen tablecloths. These tablecloths were laid on the tables in the rooms on the Titanic. The newly established company sometimes brought the workers in on Sundays to ensure that orders were ready on time. I'll go back. On Sunday, the 14th of April, 1912, the workers, including the half-timers in all of the departments, came in to finish an order for Argentina. Helena was very preoccupied with a concert that she was due to attend in the Grand Opera House that evening. She sang her way through the morning shift and into the afternoon and evening. At 2 p.m., Helena realized that her work would not be finished until about 6 p.m. and that there would be hardly any time between finishing in the mill and getting to the concert. She kept her shoes on all day, ready to leave the minute her work was complete. Margaret was tired before she even began. Margaret, the other lady. She stooped over the mop and half-heartedly dabbed it along the top floor. She stopped to chastise a young half-timer who'd only started and had not been warned about walking on Margaret's stairs. At 7 p.m., late for her concert, Helena was finished, exhausted but excited, with her heart beating and tired because of the heat and fasting all day. Helena went down the first flight of steps. She tripped on the discarded mop, fell over the banister and down to the ground floor. Margaret heard the shrieking Helena and looked up to watch Helena fall. She released her grip on the boy that she had been giving out to and staggered down to the ground floor to discover that Helena was already dead. Her intentions had been to leave the mill forever and establish herself as a singer. Of course, she may not have succeeded as a singer, and she might have been destined to stay in the spinning room for years, reminiscing about the time she sang on the Opera House in Belfast. But her death at 16 on the factory floor just dashed those aspirations. There are reasonable, sensible people who say that Helena did not escape the mill, that she still walks the very halls, trapped and still singing. So there's the discarded factory today. And then another sort of similar story is the Mary Carrick poltergeist. This is not strictly an Irish folktale, but it kind of tones in with your Conine one. Mary immigrated to America from Ireland. And so not much is known about her, other than she was a bright but illiterate, healthy young woman who immigrated to America from Ireland in about May of 1867. She found work with the family, the Wallace family, and things went very well for the first 6 weeks. But then the bells in the kitchen, that the people of the house would use to call the servants, began ringing. They rang at different intervals throughout the day, even though no one was pulling the cords, and they were 3 meters high up on the walls, the bells themselves. So the Wallace family decided to disconnect the bells, but they continued to ring, but only if Mary was in the room or the room next door. The ringing got worse and more violent throughout the day and the night. Banging and rapping started on walls and windows, always close to the room where Mary was working. Mary herself could offer no explanation, and she became hysterical. Terrified of being sacked, she pleaded with the Wallace family, "Please don't send me away." Mary had arrived from Ireland and was totally alone in America. She had no one to turn to. So when the spiritualists heard about the events surrounding Mary, it was the Wallace family who tried to protect her and would not admit these mediums into the house. Mr. Wallace believed that there must be a rational explanation for what was going on. He believed that the rapping noises must be caused by an electric phenomenon. He even went so far as to conduct experiments around Mary, like placing glass insulators under her bed to see if a current surrounded her, but they remained still while other objects moved towards her. During these attacks, Mary would become unexplainably clairvoyant, which totally flummoxed Mr. Wallace. The events in the Wallace house became more and more violent. Chairs tipped, crockery flew across the room, tables lifted into the air and landed on their sides. A heavy stone washing slab lifted into the air and was smashed onto the floor. And then in August 1867, things came to a climax. The banging and rapping got more ferocious. Pails of water tipped over, heavy furniture would fly across the room. So the Wallace family decided they would have to send Mary away for a rest, as she was nearing the point of collapse. Things in the Wallace household fell quiet for a while, but as soon as Mary returned, all hell broke loose. Things came to a head on the 12th of September when Mary suffered a breakdown and was taken to an asylum. She tried to return to work for the Wallaces, but decided that she would stay in the asylum for her safety. And it is said she stayed there working quietly as a maid for the rest of her life. But you have to ask, was it homesickness? Was it some kind of energy surrounding her because she was by herself? Or did something follow her from Ireland? We won't know the answer. So John, your last one.
Not in this world, we won't.
Yeah.
This is the story of the Beresford ghost. Lord Tyrone and Lady Beresford were born with the names John Lepore, sometimes pronounced Power, and Nicola Hamilton. As children, they were orphans, and they were raised by an atheist guardian who was determined to convert the children to his atheist views. The children continued to believe in heaven and a never-ending life, so they made a pact with each other. They decided that the first of the siblings to die would reappear to the other, thus proving that there was life after death. Nicola eventually married Sir Tristan Beresford, the oldest son of Richard, and Lady Dorothy Annesley, daughter of Arthur. One night, she woke up to find her foster brother standing beside her bed. He told her that he had just died, reminding her of their childhood pact. The spirit of her foster brother then told her of future events. He told her that her husband would die and she would remarry, that she would have 4 children, and that she would die on the day she turned 47. Terrified and doubting that her vision was real, she asked her foster brother if this was real. He grabbed her by the wrist, causing it to shrink and wither. From that day forth, she wore a black silk ribbon to hide the deformity. Everything that her foster brother had predicted came true, except for her death. She did not die on her 47th birthday. On her 48th birthday, Lady Beresford decided to celebrate the occasion with some friends because she'd made it through that year. She included a clergyman who was an old family friend. At the party, she exclaimed, "I am 48 today." The clergyman replied, "No, my dear, you're 47. When she questioned how he knew this, he said that he had looked at the registry of her birth only days before. She cried, "You have signed my death warrant." She went back to her chamber, made out her will, and died that night. Her children unwrapped the black ribbon around her wrist, and sure enough, it was withered and shriveled.
So Lady Beresford, I suppose, is still wandering the halls there in the house. But that's an interesting one because we wanted to end with this one, to talk about belief. And so isn't it funny that, while she thought she had survived the year, she was hale and hearty. And then as soon as the guy told her that, "Oh no, you're 47, she upped and died." So I don't know if that was her giving in or if it was the prophecy coming true. But we're delighted to be sharing these stories. As I say, some of them, I had heard versions of growing up. Some of them are new. We looked up, we got some of them from the internet, from things like Ireland's Own. It's an older kind of magazine. But there's hundreds and thousands of websites, devoted to all of this. And so I think those themes of alienation and togetherness, hospitality, womanhood, all of these things are kind of universal themes. And it's interesting how many of them the Irish brought with them to America. And of course, it is the origin of Halloween. We told last year the story of Stingy Jack, which is the origin of carving the pumpkin and things. Even though we didn't have pumpkins in Ireland, we had turnips or rutabagas, which is frightening in and of itself. If you see a carved rutabaga, but they were able to bring all of these traditions with them. So thank you for joining us online and for our very politely behaved audience back here. And on Thursday, we're giving a talk about some of the Irish immigrants that were activists. So people like Samuel McClure, Thomas Addis Emmet, and others, who kind of strove to make a better life for everybody. And then next week on Thursday, we have Dr. Dara Downey, I think is her name, and she's going to present about superstitious Irish maids in American Gothic fiction. So it's another Halloween kind of presentation. So thanks everyone for joining us. Mind yourselves going home in the dark and have a spooky Halloween and a full moon tonight. Thanks. Take care.